There is something inside you that has never been hurt, not by the hardest years, not by the losses you still carry, not by the moments that broke something in you, that you were not sure would ever heal, something that existed before this body was born, something that will continue after it ends, something that the ancient world, every civilization that ever looked carefully at this question, called by different names, but always pointed at the same thing, the immortal self, not as a comforting belief, not as a religious promise designed to ease the fear of death, as a direct description of what human beings actually are, at the level that matter cannot reach, at the level that time cannot touch, at the level that suffering, no matter how deep, no matter how long it lasted, could never quite get to. You have felt this in moments of profound stillness, when something in you went quiet enough, that something else became briefly present, something that felt older than your name, older than your story, older than everything that has ever happened to you. That was not your imagination. That was contact with the part of you that has never died, that cannot die, that the ancient traditions spent thousands of years teaching human beings to recognize. Tonight, we remember it together. Every civilization that has ever existed has wrestled with the same question, not as an abstract philosophical puzzle, as the most urgent practical question a human being can face. What happens when the body stops? Is that the end? Or is there something that continues? And if something continues, what is it? Where does it go? What was it doing here to begin with? These are not questions that emerge from fear alone. They emerged from direct observation, from thousands of years of careful, rigorous, documented inner investigation by people who dedicated their entire lives to looking more carefully at consciousness than most of us ever do, and what they found, what they consistently, repeatedly, independently found, across cultures that had no contact with each other, across centuries separated by vast distances of time, was not a belief, not a hope, not a comforting story, a map, a precise and detailed map of what a human being actually is. And that map, in every tradition that drew it, contained the same essential discovery, that the human being is layered, that what you see on the surface, the body, the personality, the biography, is only the outermost expression of something vastly more complex. And that at the deepest layer, there is something that does not end, cannot end, has never ended. Now, before we go into what the ancient traditions actually taught, I want to address something directly, because I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like religion. This sounds like the kind of thing that people believe because they are afraid of death. I understand that skepticism. I respect it. But what I am going to share with you tonight is not a comforting story. It is the convergent testimony of thousands of human beings across thousands of years who looked at this question directly, not through the lens of religious belief, through direct inner investigation, through sustained contemplative practice, through the kind of rigorous first-person inquiry that produces not belief, but knowledge, the kind of knowledge that does not require faith, because it has been directly encountered. The Vedic tradition of ancient India, one of the oldest continuously practiced wisdom traditions on earth, did not teach the immortality of the self as a belief. It taught it as a verifiable fact, something that could be directly confirmed by anyone willing to do the inner work, required to perceive it. The Sanskrit word for this direct knowledge is jnana, not faith, not belief, not hope, knowing, the direct, immediate, undeniable knowing. That comes from looking clearly at what is actually here, and what jnana reveals, according to thousands of years of Vedic inquiry, is so. Me think that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten how to look for, that beneath the personality, beneath the biography, beneath the body and the mind and the emotions, there is an awareness, a simple, ever-present, completely unlocatable awareness. That was here before the first thought arose this morning. That will be here after the last thought dissolves tonight. That has been here through every moment of this life, unchanged by any of it, not enhanced by the good years, not damaged by the hard ones, not born with the first breath, not ending with the last, simply here, aware, present. The Vedic teachers call this awareness Atman, and they taught with absolute consistency across centuries of transmission that Atman and Brahman, the individual awareness and the universal awareness, are not two different things, are the same thing, appearing as two because of the particular conditions of embodied existence. The wave and the ocean, not similar, not related, not connected, the same substance, the same awareness, the same presence, looking at itself through different eyes, and the death of the body. From this perspective is not the end of the wave, it is the wave returning to the ocean, not ceasing, not disappearing, returning to what it always was, to what it never stopped being, even while it was a wave. Bloco tres, disenvolvimento dois. The Vedic tradition was not alone in this discovery, half a world away. In the temples of ancient Egypt, a completely separate civilization was mapping the same territory, using different language, different imagery, different ritual forms, but arriving at the same essential recognition that the human being contains something immortal, something that the physical death of the body cannot extinguish. The Egyptians taught something more precise, more uncomfortable, more demanding than a simple promise of afterlife. They taught that the human being was a divine being who had taken on mortal form, not a mortal being, hoping to become divine after death, already divine, already eternal, already in possession of everything. That religious traditions across history have promised us a future reward, but temporarily and by choice, experiencing itself through the lens of mortality. The god Osiris, the central figure of Egyptian religious life, was not primarily understood as an external deity. He was understood as a map, a description of what every human being actually is at their deepest level. The myth of Osiris, his death, his dismemberment, his resurrection, was not a story about a god who died and came back to life. It was a map of what happens to consciousness when it incarnates in a physical body. The dismemberment of Osiris represents the fragmentation of divine consciousness as it takes on the conditions of physical existence. The gathering of the pieces represents the inner work of integration. The resurrection represents the recognition of the immortal self. That was present through the entire process. That was never actually destroyed, only apparently so. And the central affirmation of the Egyptian initiatic tradition was not a prayer to an external god. It was a declaration. I am Osiris. Not I worship Osiris. Not I hope to be like Osiris after death. I am Osiris. Right now, in this body, in this life. The divine awareness, temporarily wearing the costume of a mortal human being. What this means is something specific and useful. It means that at the deepest level of what you are, there is an awareness that is not defined by your history, not limited by your conditioning, not imprisoned by your fears, not diminished by your failures. An awareness that is, by its very nature, free, clear, undamaged. Not because anything particular has happened, because that is what awareness actually is. When it is not being filtered through the accumulated weight of a particular human story, the Egyptian initiates did not claim to be divine because they had achieved something extraordinary. They recognized themselves as divine because they had looked carefully enough at what they actually were beneath the story and found something there that could not be accounted for by any merely human explanation. Something that was present before the story began, something that would be present after it ended, something that was, even now, even in the middle of the most ordinary human life, completely untouched by any of it. Blocco quattro, disinvolvimento tres. There is a question that arises here, a question that every serious person who encounters this teaching eventually has to ask: if the immortal self is already present, if the divine awareness is already here, if nothing that happens to the outer layers can touch what is deepest, then why does it not feel that way? Why does loss feel like loss? Why does grief feel like grief? Why does the fear of death feel not like the temporary anxiety of something that knows it is immortal, but like the existential terror of something that genuinely believes it will end? This is not a small question, it is the central question. The Buddhist tradition, which has probably investigated the nature of consciousness more rigorously and systematically than any other tradition in human history, developed a specific teaching to address exactly this question. The teaching of avidya, usually translated as ignorance, but ignorance in a very specific sense, not the ignorance of lacking information, the ignorance of misidentification, of taking something to be what it is not, specifically of taking the temporary layers, the body, the personality, the biography, to be the whole of what you are, of forgetting, at the level of felt experience, the deeper layers, the immortal awareness that the outer layers are expressions of. This forgetting, the Buddhist tradition taught, is not a moral failure, not a spiritual weakness. It is the natural result of the conditions of physical existence. When consciousness takes on a body, it takes on a nervous system, and the nervous system is designed to focus attention on the immediate, on the physical environment, on the survival of the body. This focus, this narrowing of attention, is not a mistake. It is the mechanism that makes physical experience possible, that allows the infinite to genuinely inhabit the finite, that allows the ocean to actually experience being a wave. But this same mechanism also makes forgetting possible, makes misidentification possible, makes the wave believe at the level of felt experience that it is nothing but a wave, that when the wave dissolves, there will be nothing left. And this is where the suffering comes from. Not from the losses themselves, from the belief, operating below the level of conscious thought, that you are only the wave now. There is something important I want to say about this, because the teaching of the immortal self has sometimes been used as a way of bypassing grief, of telling people who are suffering that their suffering is not real, that if they truly understood their immortal nature, they would not feel the loss so acutely. This is a profound misunderstanding of the teaching. The grief is real. The loss is real. The pain of the outer layers is not an illusion to be dismissed. It is the lived experience of a consciousness that has taken on form. And form is real. The wave is real. When the wave breaks on the shore, something real happens, something particular. That will never happen in exactly that way again. And the loss of it is a genuine loss that deserves to be honoured, not bypassed. What the teaching of the immortal self offers is not the elimination of grief. It is a larger container for it, a context in which the grief can be fully felt, without the additional layer of existential terror. The wave breaks, and the water that was the wave returns to the ocean, changed in form, unchanged in substance. And the ocean continues, as it always has, as it always will. This does not make the breaking of the wave less significant. It makes it bearable. It makes it possible to be present with the grief, rather than running from it. Because the grief, as real as it is happening within something that cannot itself be grieved, cannot itself be lost, cannot itself end. Every major tradition that mapped the immortal self also mapped the obstacles to recognizing it. Not because the immortal self is difficult to find, but because we have become so thoroughly habituated to looking in the wrong direction, that the right direction feels counterintuitive. The Hermetic tradition, that extraordinary synthesis of Egyptian and Greek wisdom that shaped the foundations of Western mysticism, described the obstacle with characteristic precision. They called it the false self, not in a psychological sense, in a metaphysical one. The false self is the constructed identity, the accumulated sense of who you are. That has been built up over years, from the raw material of experience, from what happened to you, from what people told you about yourself, from the roles you learned to play, from the defenses you developed in response to the particular difficulties of your particular life. This constructed identity is not evil. It is not the enemy. It is a necessary development, a working model of selfhood that allows a human being to function in the complex social world of ordinary life. But it has a fundamental limitation. It mistakes itself for the whole story. It occupies the foreground of experience so completely, so persistently, so convincingly, that the deeper awareness behind it becomes invisible, not absent, invisible. The way the stars are invisible during the day, not because they have gone anywhere, because something brighter, more immediate, more insistent on being attended to, has drowned them out. The Sufi tradition called this condition the sleep of the heart, not the sleep of the body, the sleep of the deeper awareness, the condition in which the constructed self has become so dominant, so all-consuming, that the heart, the seat of the deeper knowing, has forgotten what it actually is, has forgotten the stars. Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet, whose words have survived 8 centuries because they are simply true, described this condition with an image that has never left me since I first encountered it. He described the human being as a reed flute cut from the reed bed, separated from its origin, and crying in every song it plays, for the home it has lost. The music of the reed, he wrote, is the music of separation. Every song, every poem, every piece of music that has ever moved you to tears, every piece of art that opens something in you that you could not name, is the reed crying for the reed bed. Consciousness, separated from its source by the conditions of embodiment, expressing its longing for reunion through every form of beauty it can generate. This is what art is. This is what love is. This is what the inexplicable ache that arrives in moments of profound beauty, or profound silence, or profound human connection actually is. The reed, remembering the reed bed, the wave, sensing the ocean beneath it, the immortal self, pressing through the layers of the constructed identity, trying to make itself known. And the question the Sufi tradition asks is not how to stop the longing. The question is how to follow the longing all the way back to its source, how to let the ache of beauty lead you inward rather than outward, toward the next beautiful thing that will almost satisfy the longing, but not quite. How to recognize in the moment when something opens in you that what is opening is not reaching towards something external. It is recognizing something internal, the reed bed, the ocean, the immortal awareness that has been here all along, that every genuine longing has always been pointing at. Not something to be found, something to be recognized as what you have always been. There is a practice that appears in the contemplative traditions of virtually every culture that has seriously investigated the nature of the immortal self. A practice so simple that the first time you hear it, you may be tempted to dismiss it, but simplicity, as the ancient traditions consistently remind us, is not the same as easiness. The practice is this: look at what is looking, not at what you are looking at, not at the thoughts, not at the feelings, not at the body or the sensations, or the memories or the plans, or the endless parade of experience that passes through awareness. In every waking moment, look at what is doing the looking. Turn the attention, not outward at the content of experience, but inward, toward the awareness that is experiencing the content, toward the one who is here, right now, receiving these words. Who is that? Not what is your name, not what is your history. Who is the one that is aware right now? Ramana Maharshi, one of the most significant contemplative teachers of the 20th century, spent his entire teaching life pointing at this single question: who am I? Not as a philosophical inquiry, as a direct investigation, as the turning of attention away from everything that is observed toward the observer itself. He taught that this question, followed honestly, without settling for any answer that could be described in words, would inevitably lead to a direct encounter with the immortal self, not as a conclusion, as a recognition, because the immortal self is not something you find at the end of the investigation. It is what is doing the investigating. The awareness that is looking for awareness is itself the awareness it is looking for. The seeker and the sought are the same thing. And when this is recognized, not intellectually, but directly, in immediate lived experience, something shifts. Not dramatically, not always with the force of a revelation, sometimes quietly, the way dawn comes, not as a sudden event, as a gradual, inevitable brightening, until at some point you realize it is no longer dark, without being able to say exactly when the darkness ended. The Zen tradition calls this recognition kensho, a seeing into one's own nature, not a permanent state of enlightenment, a glimpse, a direct seeing of what is actually here, when the constructed self becomes briefly transparent. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition calls it rigpa, the natural state of awareness, prior to any elaboration, prior to any story, prior to the construction of any identity, temporary or otherwise, just awareness, simple, present, unlocatable, without edges, without beginning or end, not produced by the brain, not dependent on the body, not born, not dying, simply here as it has always been, as it will always be, now. A human being who has directly encountered the immortal self, even briefly, even for a moment, lives differently afterward. Not because they have achieved some special spiritual status, not because they are now exempt from the ordinary difficulties of human life, but because something has shifted in the relationship between their identity and the things that happen to them. The losses are still losses. The grief is still grief. The difficulties are still difficult, but they are no longer experienced as threats to existence itself. They are experienced as what they actually are. Events in the life of the wave, real, significant, sometimes devastating, but happening within something that cannot itself be devastated, within an awareness that remains unchanged through all of it. And from that recognition, a quality of freedom becomes available. Not the freedom from difficulty, the freedom within difficulty, the freedom to be fully present with what is actually happening, without the additional weight of believing that what is happening is the end of everything. This is what the ancient traditions were offering, not an escape from mortality, a recognition of what lies beneath it, not a promise about what happens after death, a direct encounter with what was never born, and therefore cannot die right now, in this body, in this life, in this moment. If you have stayed with me this far, through the Vedic map of Atman, through the Egyptian declaration of the immortal self, through the Buddhist teaching on avidya, through the Sufi image of the reed and the reed bed, through the simple and radical instruction to look at what is looking, I want to pause for a moment, not to break what we are building, but to say something directly. This channel exists for exactly this, not for spiritual entertainment, not for ancient wisdom as decoration, for the genuine investigation of what these traditions were actually pointing at, which is not a belief to adopt, not a framework to defend, but a direct recognition available to anyone who is willing to look honestly at what is actually here. If that is what you are here for, subscribe to Sacred Flame, because what we are uncovering together, video by video, goes deeper than any single conversation can contain. And I want you present for what comes next. Now, there is one more dimension of this teaching that I have been saving for this moment, something that changes how you hold everything we have discussed. The ancient traditions did not teach the immortality of the self as a consolation prize for the difficulty of being human. They taught it as something that could be verified directly by anyone in this life, in this body, right now, not after sufficient spiritual achievement, not as a reward for correct belief, as something immediately available, to anyone willing to look clearly at what is actually present in this moment. The near-death experience research that has accumulated over the past 50 years is pointing in the same direction. Thousands of people across every culture, every religion, every level of prior spiritual belief or disbelief who have been clinically dead and returned have reported something consistent: the experience of consciousness continuing after the physical body stopped functioning, the experience of awareness that was more vivid, more clear, more real than ordinary waking consciousness, not less real, more, as if the death of the body had removed a filter, had stripped away the noise that ordinarily obscures the deeper signal, and what was left was not nothing, was not darkness, was not the end, was awareness, clear, expanded, more present than it had ever been, while confined to the ordinary conditions of a functioning physical body. Now, I want to be careful here. Near-death experiences do not prove, in the scientific sense of proof, that consciousness survives death. The evidence is compelling. The consistency across cultures and centuries is remarkable. But it is not proof. What it is testimony. The testimony of thousands of human beings who looked directly at the question from the most extreme vantage point available and reported back what they found. And what they found is consistent with what the contemplative traditions have been reporting for thousands of years: that consciousness is not produced by the body, that the body is more like a receiver than a generator, that when the receiver stops working, the signal does not stop, it simply is no longer being received by that particular instrument. The physicist David Bohm, one of the most rigorous scientific minds of the 20th century, spent the later part of his career developing a model of reality that he called the implicate order, the idea that beneath physical reality there is an enfolded, unmanifest depth from which the explicate order continuously arises. And Bohm suggested, with the careful precision of a physicist, that consciousness is not produced by matter. It belongs to the ground from which matter arises. This is not mysticism dressed in scientific language. This is a serious physicist, following the implications of quantum mechanics to their logical conclusion, and arriving somewhere that looks remarkably like what the ancient traditions have been pointing at for thousands of years: that consciousness is primary, that what you are at the deepest level is not a product of the physical world. It is part of what the physical world is a product of. There's a moment that the contemplative traditions describe in almost identical terms across every culture that has ever seriously investigated this question. A moment that arrives, not at the end of a long spiritual journey, not as a reward for sufficient practice, but in the middle of ordinary life, unexpectedly, often uninvited, a moment when something in the ordinary experience of being a human being becomes briefly transparent, when the foreground clears just enough to reveal what has always been in the background. The awareness behind the awareness, the presence behind the personality, the part that has been here through every moment of this life, unchanged by any of it. You have had this moment, not once, many times. You may not have recognized it as such. It may have arrived as a quality of unexpected stillness in the middle of something ordinary, as a sudden sense of being more here than you usually are, as the inexplicable feeling that everything is, somehow, exactly as it should be, even when nothing in particular has changed. These moments are not random. They are not glitches in ordinary experience. They are the immortal self, making itself briefly known, pressing through the layers of the constructed identity into conscious awareness, not dramatically, not with the force of a vision or a revelation, quietly, the way light enters a room, through a small gap in the curtain, not flooding the room, just present, unmistakable, reminding you that the room is not as dark as it seemed. Now, I want to leave you with something practical, not a philosophy, not a framework, a single instruction that every tradition we have explored tonight would recognize as pointing at the same thing. Tonight, before you sleep, find a moment of genuine stillness. Not meditation in any formal sense, not a technique, just stillness. Sit somewhere quiet, close your eyes, and instead of trying to think about what we have discussed, instead of trying to have a spiritual experience, simply ask one question, silently, without expecting an answer in words. Who is aware right now? Not who are you, not what is your name or your history. Who is aware? What is the awareness that is present right now, in this moment, before any thought arises to describe it? Don't answer with concepts. Don't answer with memories. Don't answer with anything you have ever been told. Just look, turn the attention toward the awareness itself, toward the one who is here, and simply notice what you find there will not be describable, not because it is mysterious, because it is prior to description, prior to language, prior to the categories the mind uses. To organize experience, it is simply present, aware, here, before all of it, beneath all of it, through all of it. That is the immortal self, not something you have to become, not something you have to earn, something that is already here, already present, already you, more you than the name, more you than the story, more you than anything that has ever happened to you, or been done to you, or taken from you. The part that was never touched, the part that cannot be touched, the part that the ancient traditions across every culture, in every century, have been pointing at, with different words, through different forms, toward the same recognition that what you are, at the deepest level, has no beginning, has no end, was never born into this body, will never die when it leaves, was always here, will always be here, is here right now. As you read these words, as you breathe, as you exist, simply here. If something in this conversation reached you, if something recognized something that it has always known, share this with 5 people, not to promote a channel, but because somewhere in your life there is someone who is afraid, not of something specific, of the thing beneath all specific fears, the fear of ending. Give them this, not as a belief to adopt, as an invitation to look for themselves and leave a comment below, not a reaction, something real. Tell me what happened in you as you listened, what quieted, what opened, what recognized itself. And if there is a question living in you, something this conversation stirred, that you want to follow deeper, leave it there, because that question is